At another episode of Two Bald Guys. My name is Dave Anderson. I'm a senior policy fellow at the Wisconsin Institute for Public Policy and Service, otherwise known as WIPPS.
I'm Eric Giordano, the Executive Director of WIPPS, and we're really happy to be here today. Dave, can you tell us a little bit about WIPPS?
Absolutely. WIPPS is a unit of the University of Wisconsin system. For over 12 years now, the organization has been focused on educating and engaging citizens, developing future leaders, and helping communities address issues that they care about.
Yeah, Dave, we're now into a full month of our show, and I think it's worth reflecting again on why we do this. It goes without saying that Dave and I feel compelled to share our enormous planet-sized heads with the entire world. And you know what they say, Dave? Massive heads equal massive brains. So honestly, though, I look at the news every day, and I know you do, and particularly this week, it's been really disheartening to see how everything has become hyper-politicized, hyper-polarized. And, we just want to confirm or mention to our two viewers that, we're trying to do something a little different here. We recognize the challenge of our current times, and we purposely do this show to add a little humor to your day and to provide some incredibly well-researched hair puns, but also to present some thoughtful ideas and to take a moment that we can all think critically about an issue that matters and not get into the sort of politicization of things that we see around us. So we just want to share that with you, and we want you to let us know if you think we're accomplishing our goal by sending us some feedback to info@wipps.org. That's info@wipps.org. And by the way, if you plan to send any feedback about our questionable sense of humor, don't bother. We hear about this every week from our spouses. And besides, our combs aren't wands, Dave, so don't expect magic. All right.
Thanks for sharing that, Eric. And I agree. I think Two Bald Guys fills kind of an interesting need out there, and I'm really pleased to be part of it. And I want to thank you for everything you do to make this show as successful as it is. Last week we mixed it up a little bit by asking our two viewers to respond to a hot snap poll. This incredibly unscientific poll yielded some incredibly weak results that we wanted to share with you. That's my attempt, Eric, to provide a humorous disclaimer that recognizes the results from our poll are only from those who tuned in while we were on Facebook Live, as well as those who follow us on Facebook. So it's not necessarily a representative sampling of the state. But let me add, though, that we do value our respondents' opinions, and we thank them for their participation. So now the results. Last week's question: do you agree or disagree with the Wisconsin Supreme Court's decision to rescind the safer at home order? Eric, a whopping 68.8% of the respondents disagreed with the Supreme Court decision, and actually 30% strongly disagreed. So what do you think about that?
Well, yeah, we have to obviously, again, disclaim that this is not a scientific poll, right? I'll just respond a little myself with anecdotally. I'm talking with my progressive friends, I'm talking with my conservative friends, and regardless of where we are, everybody's really sick and tired of the situation. We want to get back to some sense of normalcy, both from an economic perspective, but also personal perspective. I was just talking to a guy on the phone today saying, I just miss people, and I think the challenge, though, obviously, is that we still are uncertain about the safety and how we feel about going out in public and potentially risking ourselves. And it's not just ourselves, right? It's also, if I go out, then I risk the safety potentially of my spouse, my child, and so forth, maybe our parents. So, this is a really tough issue, and I think we're all really struggling, honestly. What are your thoughts?
No, I agree. I think it's a challenge for everyone, and there's as with everything else, you alluded to it earlier. There's a real division, I think, in the state on a lot of different things, and certainly this hasn't eluded that as well.
The one thing that this poll kind of reminds me of is the fact that there's a part of me that thinks we should listen to our public health officials, right? They know best. On the other hand, we don't have any clear I mean, who's going to determine when it's all clear? Who's going to make that decision, and what's that going to look like? And I know that there's policies around phasing in, and so those are important that we can look at that. But there's still a lot of individual decisions that people have to make. And even if we disagree generally with the idea that we shouldn't have a plan, that's, I think, what the poll is revealing. It does seem that there's still a lot of ambiguity about how to best, open up and return to some sense of normalcy, and when that's even appropriate.
Yeah. So Eric, what's our poll question this week?
All right. Well, this week, and this is really based squarely on our featured guest that we'll introduce shortly. It's a similar poll question to what the Bipartisan Policy Center asked to a national audience. We're going to ask it to our Wisconsin audience. And the question is this. Let's see if I can find it. Do you agree or disagree that the federal government should prioritize using immigration policies to address the economic fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic? I'm not expecting you to memorize that question, dear audience. If you look at your Facebook chat section, you can see a link to that poll. Please go ahead and click on that and take that if you will. If you're watching this in a recorded version, you can find the poll by going to WIPPS.org/poll. That's WIPPS.org/poll. So the question is about, using immigration policy to address the COVID fallout. So take a look, and we'd love to hear your responses. Dave, are we ready for our story of the week?
Absolutely.
Okay, good.
All right, we've got another wacky one this week, gentlemen. So a man is facing a $7,300 fine for wrestling with a bear at a Polish zoo and breaking COVID-19 rules by not wearing a mask. The 23-year-old, who is thought to have been drunk at the time, was filmed by visitors to Warsaw Zoo wrestling with a bear named Sabrina. The man and the bear were uninjured. Side note, when I was researching the story, I found out there was an incident almost 5 years ago to the day where another man, probably drunk, broke into I believe the same enclosure and punched a bear. So that's something against bears in Poland, I suppose.
Well, all I can say is that guy sure has a knack for getting himself into some hairy situations, which is probably why his friends consider him a cut above the rest.
Wow. I don't know which was worse, the story or the pun, but anyway, and you forgot to introduce Luke, who, by the way, remember, all our dear viewers, is our favorite representative of an attractive younger demographic. So thanks, Luke, for that crack research, especially the additional research about this fact this is the second incident, man v. bear, in Poland. And I wonder, Dave, we're from Wisconsin, right? And I don't know if this is how the people of Poland, because right, we should be stereotyping everybody, want to prove their manhood. But here in Wisconsin, they have things like lumberjack festivals, and people climb trees and hack down stuff like that. I don't do this, obviously. So it just makes me wonder, is this some kind of rite of passage? Do you have to go in and wrestle a bear? I mean, this is insane. I really don't get it. But I also don't get, Luke, why every wacky story has to involve animals. Is there some reason for that? I really like
animals or intoxicated people, I think, is the theme.
Okay, or the combination. Okay,
there you
great.
Go.
All right, well, guess what? It's time for our featured guest of the week. And we are so excited and pleased to welcome Theresa Cardinal Brown, who's the Director of Immigration and Cross-Border Policy for the Bipartisan Policy Center in Washington, D.C. She has an illustrious background and a great deal of experience in the public and private sector, and is a featured guest on many programs, including Fox News, NPR Morning Edition, PBS NewsHour, CNN International, and BBC World. And now, of course, a guest on possibly the most important media platform in our planet's history, Two Bald Guys. And Teresa, this must be really daunting for you to be a guest for us, but welcome, and we're so glad you had the courage to come on the show today.
Well, I am so honored to have been asked to come on board and speak to maybe now 4 listeners, if I retweeted correctly. Your
that may be generous. That may be generous, but thank you.
We might double it today, just because I tweeted out to my couple of followers on Twitter. But
so your mom's watching too. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, anyway, welcome. And why don't you tell us a little bit, Teresa, quickly about what is the Bipartisan Policy Center anyway? What do you guys do?
Sure. So the Bipartisan Policy Center is one of the innumerable think tanks in Washington, D.C. We've been around for about 13 years now. We are unique, we believe, in that we are purposefully bipartisan, as stated in the name. We were founded by 4 former Senate Majority Leaders, Tom Daschle, Bob Dole, Howard Baker, and George Mitchell. And the concept of their founding was to have a place outside of Congress that can help facilitate the kind of deliberation and bipartisan spirit of bringing people together to come to pragmatic and practical solutions to some of the country's biggest problems. And so we tackle a wide variety of issues. We have about, I'd say, 12.5 different projects on a lot of different topics, everything from energy and healthcare to the economy and budgets, to housing and infrastructure, and of course, the subject I deal with, which is immigration.
You know, Teresa, the issue of immigration reform is incredibly divisive and clearly evokes strong feelings from a variety of different perspectives. When we discuss the desire, actually the need, to put together a bipartisan approach to immigration reform, how do we even begin that conversation? Where's the overlap in the views of individuals who feel so strongly about this that we can use to start that discussion? What's your experience been?
Well, I think there's a couple of things to understand. One is that debates about immigration are not new for our country. They have been going on since our founding, and every new wave of immigrants has people saying, who are these new people and what are they doing to my country? And this goes back to Benjamin Franklin, who famously thought that the Germans in Pennsylvania would mean that there would be no English taught in German schools, and that the Germans the swarthy colored Germans were not up to the same standards as the English settlers. So, I mean, again, this is not new for our country. It's always been somewhat controversial, but in terms of actually creating immigration policy, the type of debate you often hear on the news, the polarization, the extremes, don't necessarily represent a majority of Americans. Most Americans, when you sit down and listen to them and talk to them about immigration, have kind of practical, pragmatic views on it. Like, okay, we want a secure border, but we're also willing to be pretty generous to people who are here and contributing. And we just want a system that works and that works for us and that we can understand. And none of those things seem to be true about our current immigration system. So I think it's important that we understand that, first of all, for most people, immigration isn't their top of mind issue. And we'll talk about that from our poll in a second. But when they do think about immigration, it's one of those things like, yeah, it doesn't really work, but you know, can't Washington do something about it? Why aren't they? So that's I think where we start.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up. What do you think drives that divisiveness when it comes to discussion on immigration reform?
I think there's a lot of different aspects that drive it. First of all, it can be deeply personal for a lot of people. Deeply personal in that they are immigrants or have immigrants in their family. And so for them, whatever the policy is affects them personally. It can be deeply personal for people who feel that their way of life is changing, or that people they don't know and understand are moving into their neighborhoods. Change is hard. And sometimes that's uncomfortable, and that can allow people to, you know, be concerned about what's happening. There are undercurrents, and always have been, of racism. You know, this is sort of the issue that the United States has to deal with on a lot of areas. But the other thing I would say is that immigration is kind of an easy thing to blame for a lot of other issues that we have in the country. So if the economy's down, it's easy to look at immigrants. If we think there's a security issue, it's easy to look at immigrants. If we think that there's a health issue, it's easy to look at immigrants. That's not always the case that it's true. It just makes sort of an easy other group or thing to sort of cast the blame and try to figure it out. But the reality is that immigrants and immigration are neither the cause nor, frankly, the miracle solution to all of our country's problems. And I think that's one of the ways we need to look at it from a bipartisan perspective, is that we try to look for, it's going to be everything to all people. It's going to be a little hard to get done.
Yeah, that's interesting. And that kind of leads me to ask this question, which is, what are 1 or 2 or 3 of the biggest myths or assumptions about immigration that you find as an expert and through the Bipartisan Policy Center that you're constantly having to debunk or just educate people about?
Yeah, I think there are several different myths about immigration. One is that one important one that's a historical issue is that that immigration is harder today than it ever has been in our country's history. People, especially people who have been, their immigrant ancestors or several generations back, believe that immigrants coming to the United States today have it as easy as their ancestors did in getting on a ship and coming to Ellis Island. And the reality is that until really the early 1950s, immigration to the United States was pretty widely open. And what I mean by open is you didn't have to have a special visa to come. There were no requirements to immigrate. There were just exclusions that could keep you from immigrating. You might not be able to immigrate if you were a thief, or you were a pauper, or if you had a communicable disease. Those are some of the oldest grounds of exclusion that we have in our immigration laws. But for the most part, if you came and you looked like you could work and support yourself, then hi, welcome in. There wasn't a lot of, but now, in order to come in, not only do you not have to be excludable under any of 24 different categories, but you also have to qualify to come in the first place in one of a lot of narrower categories. So maybe you have to have an employer sponsor you. Maybe you have to have a particular relative in the United States who can sponsor you to come. Maybe you have to be a person of extraordinary ability in your field, such as yourselves, that could come and make a contribution in the United States. But the pathways are relatively narrow. And I think that's one of the misconceptions that people have when they talk about, well, why can't you just come in legally? My grandparents did, or my great-grandparents did. And I think one of the biggest myths is that the system simply is much, much more challenging to navigate and much, much more restrictive than it was, in the early 20th century. I think the other biggest misconception that a lot of people have is that we do have a lot of people who are in the United States in an unauthorized status. They don't have legal status. Maybe they came in illegally. Maybe they came in on a visa and just stayed longer than they were supposed to, or worked when they weren't supposed to. The estimates are about 10.5 to 11 million people in that status. And I think one of the things that some people believe is that they could go down, I've heard this literally, go down to the post office and get their papers in order. And why don't they just do that? And the answer goes back to the answer to number one, which is the system is incredibly complicated. And we really do not have ways that the majority of people who have an undocumented status can fix their status themselves. The law is pretty clear that if you are in an undocumented status in the United States, you're not really eligible for legally coming back to the United States if you were to leave, at least for 10 years, maybe longer. And you still have to have one of those sponsorship categories, and your past undocumented status may prevent you from coming in at all. So I think those are probably the two greatest misunderstandings that I encounter. There are a lot of areas of debate, such as the economic impact of immigrants on wages and jobs and other things like that we'll talk about. Those are areas where a lot of economists and scientists come down on one side, but a lot of people still hold views on the other side. It's still a little bit debatable, but I think those first two are the biggest misconceptions that I would say it would be great if the public had a better understanding of.
Yeah, well, thanks for sharing. I mean, this is a really complex issue, let's be honest. But I think this could be unprecedented. Luke, do we have a question from a viewer?
We do. This is a question from John, or one of our viewers. Can our guest discuss the issue of illegal versus legal immigration? Seems there are many strong feelings about illegal immigration, and in particular related to taxpayer support for basic needs for illegal immigrants.
Sure, I'm happy to answer that. So one thing to bear in mind is that if somebody is in the United States in an illegal or unauthorized status, they are not eligible for any federally funded taxpayer benefits or subsidies. This is probably another big myth or misconception, is that undocumented people are getting welfare or are getting food stamps or are getting other benefits, and they are not eligible at all. Even legal immigrants, people who have green cards, are not eligible for most of those benefits and services until they've had that green card 5 years, which coincidentally is the exact time period it takes for them to be eligible to naturalize to get citizenship. So laws are pretty clear that for most of these kinds of services, undocumented immigrants are not eligible for these kind of benefits. Now, you'll hear stories all the time of people seeing people getting food stamps at the grocery store or something like that. And there's a couple of reasons why that might lead to some misconceptions. First of all, you cannot tell by looking for somebody what their immigration status is. There is a very broad perception that the majority of immigrants in the United States right now are undocumented. That is patently untrue. The majority of immigrants in the United States have green cards or are naturalized citizens. That is up to 65% of those here who are foreign born have either already naturalized to become citizens or have green cards. The unauthorized population make up about just under a quarter of the foreign born people in the United States right now. So that's something to bear in mind. The other thing to understand is that many unauthorized immigrants are currently living in what we call mixed status families. They may be married to an American citizen. They may have American children born in the United States. That spouse, those American children, would be eligible for benefits. And if that person is a caregiver, they may be collecting those benefits on behalf of someone else. So in general, that's also worth understanding that undocumented immigrants are not generally eligible for these kinds of things. And the other thing I would say is that even when they are undocumented, they are paying taxes. Everyone who purchases everything is subject to a sales tax if there is a state or local sales tax, so they are paying taxes in that benefit. If they are renting housing or own housing in the United States, which they can do, they would be subject to property taxes. Many of them are working, and even though they're technically not authorized to work, they may still be working on the books and paying into federal Social Security and income tax through various means. We have a whole blog post on our website. If you just Google Bipartisan Policy Center and how do immigrants pay taxes, there's a whole explainer on there on how that happens. But the truth is they pay billions of dollars a year in state, local, and federal taxes. But as I said, for the most part, they're not eligible for benefits.
Great, thanks. And thanks for taking that off the cuff question there. And Teresa, the Bipartisan Policy Center, we referenced this once or twice, has recently commissioned a study on the impact of COVID-19 on people's thoughts about public policy issues generally. And of course, one of the segments was around their thoughts about immigration. What are the results? What did you find from that survey?
Sure. So this was a poll that we did with an organization called Morning Consult here in Washington, D.C. that does regular ongoing polling of Americans on a wide variety of issues. So we asked them to ask a few specific questions on our behalf. And the poll was conducted on May 7th and 8th with over 1,900 registered voters. And we were trying to understand how the public viewed the recent actions of the president to restrict immigration coming into the United States in light of COVID-19. So we asked a couple of different questions. We first asked, what do you think the federal government should be focusing on in responding to COVID-19? And we asked them to rank 6 different policy options: developing treatment and vaccines for COVID-19, increasing testing for COVID-19, reopening business and getting people back to work, providing additional financial support to workers and small businesses, shutting off immigration to the United States to preserve American jobs, the executive order President Trump issued, or allowing migrant workers to enter the United States to continue to support the food supply. This was another action that President Trump did, is that he created exemptions from some of these bans for people coming in to work in agriculture. What we found is that the majorities of Republicans and Democrats, of voters across the board, ranked the healthcare responses to COVID-19 number 1 and number 2. 36% said developing treatment and vaccines for COVID-19 should rank number 1. Another 28% ranked that as number 2. So the majorities thought that should be first or second priority. Majorities also thought that the second priority should be increasing tested for COVID-19. 29% ranked it first, 33% ranked it second. After that came the economic and financial policies. Reopening business and getting people back to work was ranked third by 17% and fourth by 30%. So in that middle ranking. Providing additional financial support to workers and small businesses was ranked second by 18%, third by 36%. And then the two immigration issues ranked fifth and sixth, ranked right there at the bottom, with 39% ranking shutting off immigration to the United States to preserve jobs as six, and 37% ranking allowing migrant workers to enter the U.S. to continue to support the food supply as six. So overall, what we took away from this is that clearly for the American public, immigration issues are not top of mind. And regardless of whether or not they support those actions, they don't think they should be the government's priorities. We then did ask explicitly whether people approved or disapproved of President Trump's decision to temporarily suspend the issuance of new green cards for 60 days. And here we did find a majority did approve of that policy. 35% strongly approved, another 23% disapproved. And this is consistent with other polling that has been done by other platforms, most notably the Washington Post and University of Maryland did a poll shortly after the executive order is issued that showed similar results. 14% disapproved, 17% strongly disapproved, and 11% didn't know or had no opinion. But we then asked, how effective did people think that that decision to temporarily suspend the issuance of new green cards would be in opening more jobs for American workers during COVID-19? This was the explicit rationale that the president indicated in the executive order. And here we saw a split. 22% thought it might be very effective. 25% thought it would be somewhat effective. So 47% thought it would be effective. But another 41% thought it would be not too effective or not at all effective, and 13% didn't know. So this to me reflects the understanding that a lot of Americans have, is that they're not sure about the economic impacts of immigration. In spite of supporting this action, they're not really sure of how effective it will be. Interestingly enough, when broken down by employment status of the respondents, those who were unemployed did not necessarily think that it would be very helpful. We asked another question about whether immigrants would help or hurt the United States' long-term economic recovery to COVID-19. And here again, a very big split. 28% thought that they help. 27% were neutral. They've neither helped nor hurt. 26% would think they would hurt, and 19% had don't know or no opinion. Of the unemployed who answered that question, 31% believed that immigrants helped with the recovery, and 23% thought they hurt the economy. So this is very interesting to us because the unemployed ostensibly are the ones that the executive action was meant to help, and yet they were some of the more skeptical about the impact of this. Conversely, retirees, homemakers, and people who were out of the business world, were not employed, seemed to think that immigrants were more hurtful, and that the president's action would be more helpful for American workers. So we're not entirely sure why those particular results came out, but we thought they were interesting. What we see here, though, is that, first of all, there is a bipartisan belief that immigration should not be the first measure of response for COVID-19. It should not necessarily be a priority. They really want the government to mitigate the health emergency, focus on direct economic recovery, and immigration policies have kind of a mixed bag in terms of whether or not people think they will actually make that much of a difference, even if they support the actions being done. But I think it's also very important to note this division or split, ambivalence, if you will, among a lot of Americans as to understanding how immigrants help or hurt the economy. And I think that's something that we need to pay attention to and figure out how we can either better explain these issues, or I think some of it is based on the system we have, which isn't clear about how immigrants and the immigration system can help America.
Oh, that's fascinating. And it'll be interesting to see how opinions change, or if they change. And there's a lot of assumptions going on in my question here, my comment, that if we start having some mitigation of the COVID virus, or you know, that we're on the downslope and people are starting, and we're starting to recover, if immigration will once again become a more of a priority issue or less. It'll be interesting to see how that changes over time.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's true. I mean, if you look historically, and when polls of voters and issues voters care about come up, immigration consistently is in the top 10 somewhere. Before COVID, in the last 5 years, it probably reached its highest at issue number 2 or 3. A lot of that probably has to do with the fact that President Trump ran on immigration as a significant issue in 2016. He's made immigration issues and border issues a centerpiece of his administration throughout his tenure. It certainly seems like he intends to make it an issue going into the fall election. And of course, him making an issue on his side, also the Democrats and their side are making an issue on their side. So, but in general, I think right now, at least, Americans are more concerned about COVID and responding to COVID than dealing with immigration.
Great. Well, Teresa, I know next week you're going to be hosting some online conversations in Wisconsin, and you've been doing some of these in other states as well, asking people about how they feel about immigration, where they, their opinion, really digging into some people's personal experiences. And WIPPS is actually supporting this project. You'll be doing this next week with some residents from Madison and doing this with some residents from central Wisconsin. And by the way, to our viewer or two, there are a couple slots still open. So if you're interested in participating in this, please contact us at info@wipps.org. But tell us, what are you trying to learn from these conversations with people in Wisconsin about immigration, and what will you do with that information?
Sure. So one of the things that we have learned, both from polling that we have done and from various conversations we've had around the country, is that the way the immigration debate is framed, if you will, on social media, on radio talk shows, on cable TV, is very black and white. It's very, you're either for it or against it. You believe certain things and believe them very powerfully. But when you actually talk to people, there's a lot more nuance to how they think about things. It's neither good nor bad. They want to see some changes, but they're not sure really what. And so one of the things we're trying to accomplish by doing this is, one, getting outside of Washington, D.C., at least virtually, by doing this. We're not actually going to Wisconsin, unfortunately. And hearing how people actually think and talk about these issues. When they dive down a little behind whatever talking points they have seen, how do they understand the issues? What do they think about these things? What are their biggest concerns? And even more importantly, what would they like to see changed? If we were to create a new immigration system, what should it look like? And usually when we've had these kind of conversations, we are surprised to find that there's a lot of agreement on the types of policies that they would support. And I think there's a desire for a system that is understandable, that is consistent, that is fair to immigrants and to American workers. I think there's less concern generally about immigrants being people who are taking jobs or depressing wages. Interestingly enough, more people are concerned, like the questioner, that somehow immigrants are taking more benefits. And I think that we could probably develop some really interesting policy ideas that could get bipartisan support by just listening to people and the kinds of things they think we should pay attention to.
Well, great. So we hope some of you might be interested in joining us. And again, you can do that by contacting us at info@wipps.org. Thank you so much for being with us, Teresa. You and the Bipartisan Policy Center do terrific work. And it just proves that even people with abundant hair are also very intelligent. So
I would be happy to lend you some. It's grown quite a bit since we've been self-isolating. So if it would help, I'm happy to donate to the cause.
We do appreciate it, but that's also assuming we want it. And I'm not sure we do, but thank you so much. And it looks like, once again, we apologize to Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. We've run out of time.
Oh,
Yes, I know it's sad, but maybe next week, hopefully. So, Dave, do you have any parting thoughts for us?
Eric, I don't think I told you, my sister has become a real loyal viewer of our show, and she talks to me about it, provides feedback every week, actually. It got me thinking about my childhood and our childhood growing up in northern Wisconsin. And, I recall that she really loved playing with scissors all the time when she was a kid. I bet you're wondering why she liked playing with scissors. Really, there was no particular reason for it. I think it was just for the sheer fun of it.
I'm speechless. But Dave, I do want to say how much I appreciate you, and I say to you what a bald man would say if he received a comb for his birthday. Parting is such sweet sorrow. So until next week, Teresa, thanks again. Thanks, Luke. We'll
Thank
see
you
you.
guys.